There is total fury about the government's tax raid on farmers, and the Daily Express have since published research by the Taxpayers Alliance revealing the UK government is handing £500 million to farmers in Africa, Asia and South America. More than £536 million is being spent overseas on 10 programmes, including grants to promote low-carbon agriculture practices in Brazil, the world's 11th richest country. Another scheme, worth more than £16 million, aims to help new farmers in Rwanda produce tea for the first time. Well, that'll have you spitting your cuppa out, won't it? To react, I'm delighted to welcome one of the people involved in this research, Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance. Hi, Elliot. Good to see you.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
OK, so what's the story here?
Well, so as your viewers will know, we spend quite a significant amount of money on foreign aid. We spend 0.5% of GDP every single year on foreign aid. That's actually down from what it was a few years ago.
0.7% originally?
0.7%, yeah, exactly. So Rishi Sunak, one of the few things that he did that was on the side of taxpayers was to bring that down to 0.5%, and a big chunk of that foreign aid spending goes on rural and environmental programmes. So the 10 programmes that you've listed there cover £500 million. There's actually a whole, a range more programmes. That £500 million spans quite a significant period of time. But just in the current financial year, we're spending about 120 million on rural programmes and another 450 million on environmental programmes.
And isn't that important? Don't we need to help farmers abroad transition to kind of a low-carbon business model?
So I think the issue is with some of these programmes is if you just read the briefs to them, you read the basic description, it normally sounds fairly worthwhile. The reality is often the actual metrics they use to evaluate these programmes are pretty weak. Often they don't really make much of a difference. These are large amounts of money to the British public, but actually, if you're trying to solve world hunger, a few £100 million isn't really going to make a difference.
I mean, what about the idea that this kind of donation abroad gives us soft diplomatic power? And also, what about the empathy argument? These are poor countries, we're a rich country.
Yeah, I just don't buy the soft power argument. So many of these countries have engaged with Russia, engaged with China in recent years, done things directly against our national interest. And listen, we have a situation at the moment where the United Kingdom government, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, are launching a massive tax raid on British farmers because they think that the UK government doesn't have enough money already, and so it needs a little bit more from farmers. And at the same time, we're sending out actually a roughly similar amount of money to what we're going to gain from farmers out to farmers.
Well, that's right. The inheritance tax raid may raise about £500 million a year, and that's the figure.
Yeah, so the 500 million that we talk about with inheritance tax from farmers, that actually covers the changes to business relief as well. So actually the section from farmers is probably actually quite a bit smaller.
Yeah, so any farmers watching the show tonight, and plenty do, ought to be quite furious about this.
Yeah, and the reason why they're able to watch this show is because it's quite late in the evening now. Actually, most farmers are out from, the crack of dawn until late into the evening. I spoke to many of the farmers at the protest. They were not happy to be at the protest. They didn't see it as sort of a jolly like a lot of the Saturday protesters do on Whitehall protesting the Palestine-Israel issue. They were there often losing out, significant amounts of income from the day. Yeah. But because of how passionately they believe in this issue.
Well, what about the idea that this inheritance tax raid on farmers is about making sure that wealthy individuals don't buy up land in order to enjoy tax relief?
Yeah, so the argument behind this is that, you're taxed at 40% of your assets above £1 million. And so if you move that money into agricultural property as a result, you will then be exempt from that tax. My answer to that is scrap inheritance tax entirely. If you're not happy about that exemption and that distortion, get rid of all inheritance tax. It doesn't raise that amount of money. It's a tax directly on the families who are grieving for the loss of a loved one. It's a tax on, an estate that has already been taxed throughout its existence. Get rid of the whole thing, Mark.
But do you think that inheritance tax on farmers is particularly egregious?
Yeah. So
why have the farmers enjoyed exemption, hitherto?
Yeah, so I think government and bureaucrats have generally recognised that farmers are in a unique situation, right? In the sense that most farmers sit on what looks like a relatively significant amount of wealth, but wealth that they never actually realise. So their actual day-to-day income, the actual monthly income that they get is quite small. Yes, they may have a combine harvester that is worth £250,000, but what good is £250,000 to you if it's all in a combine harvester? So there is a recognition that when a farmer passes their farm on to the next generation, although they're passing on a huge amount of wealth, the actual amount of money that the next generation is getting in their bank account is actually quite small.
OK, so if you weren't going to have this inheritance tax raid on farmers, where would you raise the $500 million for nurses, for school teachers and for police?
Well, I think we have to remember that it's the whole of the public sector that is getting a pay rise. So, yeah, we talk about nurses, we talk about teachers, we talk about police, but it's also every single civil servant, every single pen pusher, every single diversity member, EDI role, every single communications role. And frankly, the simple reality with the public sector is they get access to pension, perks and pay that we don't get in the private sector. And so if we're talking about increased pay for public sector workers, I'm afraid it's not the right time.
All right, so what you would do is you would spare the farmers and then you would, fire people in the public sector or not give them pay rises?
I would like to see a significant reduction in the number of people working in the public sector. Undoubtedly, it's 500,000 more, I think, than before it was before COVID. At the same time, public services are not really working very well, so it shows that they're not sufficiently productive. And I'd also like to see fundamental reform to public sector pensions so they're more affordable for taxpayers.
Oh, my goodness. Elliot for Prime Minister. Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. My viewers and listeners will be really shocked about that statistic.